Hi, I'm Jake Schneider, SANS Editor-in-Chief, and I'm very excited to introduce the poet Kanika Agrawal, whose work we featured in our 19th issue and who presented alongside three other poets during our opening webinar of our Poetic Vision event series, which is about poetry that is influenced by visual art and, in her case, the natural sciences. Unfortunately, we ran a bit short on time during that webinar and didn't have a chance for deeper conversation after her fantastic presentation. So we continue the conversation over Zoom a week later. This video includes both that presentation from the webinar and our follow-up conversation about her poetry and its relationship to science, which was really incredibly illuminating. Enjoy.
So I wanted to start with this image of a DNA gel because it's something that's it's an object that's a touchstone in the archive of objects and images of objects that I have in my mind and memory, and something I sort of keep returning to almost as if it were an illuminated manuscript. And what this shows, this is a method used in various fields, but in my context, to do molecular or biological work, which allows you to detect the size of DNA fragments in a sample. And I won't go into details about why you might want to do that, but you run your samples of DNA through an agarose gel matrix, and because DNA is negatively charged, it runs through the matrix towards a positive charge at the other end, towards a positive electrode. And the larger the DNA fragments are, the more slowly they'll move. And so you can determine how large your DNA fragments are based on how far they get through the matrix. And you also include what's called a DNA ladder along the side. These are fragments you already know the weights of, so that you can compare your sample weights to the weights of the fragments in your ladder and determine the size of your fragments. So there's that practical purpose, but there's also sort of just the beauty of the ritual of preparing the samples and the matrix and loading them into the wells and running the gel, and then especially visualizing it in this way through the use of, in this case, ethidium bromide, which intercalates between the bases of the DNA molecules, and when put under UV light, it fluoresces this beautiful orange color. So I think for me, part of what an object, an image like this demonstrates is how much love of sensory experience and objects is actually embedded in scientific practice. That it's not this completely abstract, rational pursuit, that you're very much in contact with and in emotional relationship with your materials and techniques. That leads me to these quotes from Sherry Turkle, and MIT professor Sherry Turkle is a sociologist and psychologist who studies people's relationships with science and technology. In her editor's introductions to the essay collections Falling for Science, Objects in Mind, and Evocative Objects, Things We Think With, she writes this: thinking with and about things is not a cold intellectual enterprise, but is charged with eros. Science is fueled by passion, a passion that often attaches to the world of objects, much as the artist attaches to his paints, the poet to his or her words. And we find it familiar to consider objects as useful or aesthetic, as necessities or vain indulgences. We are on less familiar ground when we consider objects as companions to our emotional lives or as provocations to thought. The notion of evocative objects brings together these two less familiar ideas, underscoring the inseparability of thought and feeling in our relationship to things. We think with the objects we love the objects we think with. So I love that gel glowing almost like a threat in a darkened room. And perhaps even more, I love the DNA that's made visible within it or through it. And I love the many ways in which scientific techniques, images, and text have allowed me indirectly to see DNA. This, for example, is a diagrammatic figure of DNA in the famous Watson and Crick paper of 1953, which first outlined the structure or proposed the structure for DNA as a double helix. This is the X-ray crystallography image produced by Rosalind Franklin's lab, which was essential in deciphering the structure of the double helix structure of DNA. And this leads me to the project that Jake mentioned, a few excerpts of which were published in SAND. My project, Okazaki Fragments, which is actually named after these small bits of DNA called Okazaki Fragments. These are formed during the DNA replication process. So, we all have cells, all our cells have DNA. When our cells divide, which they must do for us to continue living, the DNA must replicate and multiply so that all of the cells can continue to keep the same amount of DNA in them. And what's fascinating to me about an aspect of that process of replication for this DNA object that I love is that when DNA replicates, its two strands separate. DNA strands have an orientation. And what that means for DNA replication, without getting into too many of the details, is that one of the newly synthesized strands in replication can just go ahead and replicate continuously. The bases just keep getting added on, no problem. Unfortunately, the other strand, which has the opposite orientation, cannot be replicated continuously. It has to be replicated discontinuously. And that process is what was discovered by the Okazakis, and the Okazaki fragments are the little fragments of DNA that are a part of that discontinuous replication process that are then sort of stitched or ligated together later to form the complete strand. And so what was so interesting to me about this was thinking about, the project, my project, Okazaki Fragments, is an exploration of the interactions between and at the intersections of scientific and poetic thought, language, and attention. So it adapts concepts, images, and language from a series of 16 scientific papers on this research on discontinuous replication. And these papers were published between 1968 and 1977. The series is called Mechanism of DNA Growth. And the research was led by the Japanese molecular biologists Okazaki and Okazaki. Okazaki Fragments reconstructs Okazaki and Okazaki's experiences by reading their lives into or out of their scientific papers. And I do this in part because there isn't a great deal of biographical information available about the Okazakis, but also because I thought it would be really interesting to think about how concepts of replication, continuity, discontinuity, fragmentation would ramify when applied to the human lives of the scientists who did this work. In a sense, I put the Okazakis under their own microscope. I wonder what might scientific texts on replication, discontinuity, complementarity, etc., reveal about the Okazakis' lives and our own lives if we expand the ways in which we read or encounter them. Okay, so I'm going to skip that. So I'm going to give a couple of examples from the manuscript of how I worked with the scientific papers. And in the interest of time, I probably won't go through all of the examples that I have. So this is the first page of the final paper in that series of papers. And at the bottom of it is actually a note about the death of one of the Okazakis who died just before this final paper was published from leukemia. And that leukemia may have been a result of exposure to radiation during the Hiroshima bombings. And this is how I work with that text or image of that text. I perform an erasure of it that keeps only the components of the syllabic components of the name Okazaki. So everything that is, the syllables that are part of the name Okazaki are retained and everything else is erased. And this becomes a way to think about repetition, replication, and also how fragments come together or come apart in the formation of molecules, but also in the formation of names in human lives. So what I'm really interested with in playing with something like erasure in poetic form is how it forms or reforms our attention to the scientific text or within the scientific text and the concepts that they're exploring. Lucy Alford, in Forms of Poetic Attention, writes, "It is true that poetic language is densely formed, but what is formed by and in poetic language is an event of attention generated in the acts of reading and writing. I suggest that a poem might be better understood not simply as a gathering of composed formal features, but as an instrument for tuning and composing the attention. We begin to see attention not as a fact, not as trend, not as mandate, but rather as medium, a medium that can be formed in a variety of ways and which makes up the structures and terrains of inner experience where it meets sensual perception. And going a step further, we begin to see the poetic not as a narrow set of qualities or ideals, but as a process through which the material of language forms dynamically and fundamentally the very shape and texture of inner life." So poetic form forms attention. And this is part of what I'm exploring in my appropriations and adaptations and erasures of the scientific text. I think I'll quickly go through one more example and then end there because I think I'm over my time. So this is another image. It's a table from that final paper. And I won't try to explain it, but this is the version of it that I created, and that's it's one of the pieces published in Sand. And then the text responding to those A, B, C, D, E, F, G conditions, experimental conditions. And one of those, for example, C is Okazaki wades in floral tracts with 8 hands and a face lit like a catastrophe. And that's informed by, these conditions are informed by the language of the paper itself, but also by additional information about the Okazakis I know, such as one Okazaki's exposure to the atomic bombs, and then also other sources such as this photograph from the Japanese photographer Nobuyoshi Araki, who for many years took photographs of his wife, and these were compiled into Winter Journey and then in even longer Sentimental Journeys. And this is an image of her in her casket after her death. And I was thinking about how their relationship and the documenting of it gave me another way to think about the Okazaki's relationship and how I was writing into or out of it through their scientific papers. And so I sort of borrowed this image from Araki's work and transposed it into the Okazaki's lives as related in my work. This is another image that informed one of my the ending of one of my poems. They're them being hand in hand as Araki's wife was dying becomes an image that I transpose into one of the poems. This is another image from a paper that I connected to Agnes Martin's work. This is a series of screen prints called On a Clear Day, and also to the painter Mark Bradford's work, which is inspired actually by Agnes Martin's series On a Clear Day. And then it shows up in this way in my work, and some of just a couple of lines associated with that, or it begins with the phrase on a clear day, and then later it includes the lines, Okazaki leans to retrieve a book of varied grids from a bag, admiring their pure forms, again, their different sameness. Okazaki thinks their thoughts, which are their lines, which now Okazaki becomes. In the moment, Okazaki turns a page, Okazaki ceases.
Great, thank you so much for coming back. So for everyone watching at home, we unfortunately ran out of time during the Crowdcast webinar, so we have met up again on Zoom a week and a half later to discuss the presentation again at a little bit more length, and because we had so many questions. And we also have some questions, not from the audience that night, but from another poet, Aditi Machado. So I will use those as audience questions during our little conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me again.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for taking the time. And I should say, Aditi was in the audience for the Crowdcast as well.
Okay, sorry. So Aditi,
yeah.
so she was. It's a audience question from an audience member, but now in the
Who
future,
I happen to know. Yes.
who you happen to know.
Yeah.
Great. Well, yeah. I really enjoyed your presentation. I thought this kind of combination of aesthetics and sort of the kind of scientific rigor was really interesting. Like, almost the aesthetic experience you have in the lab, the way you described. I mean, I wrote down a few of the since I had the benefit of time, a few of the lines that you said. I love that gel glowing almost like a threat in a darkened room. I wasn't sure if you said threat. Was that the right word?
Yeah, I did. It's partly because the materials you're using, the UV light, the ethidium bromide, these are carcinogenic or mutagenic, and so you do have to protect yourself when handling the materials and when viewing the gel. So there is this kind of, it is as if it's dangerous. There's a kind of threat there, but that's also part of the excitement of it.
It's not the level of remove is not what we imagine for scientists, kind of being completely sterile, but actually they're physically threatened by the materials that they're using. The,
Yeah, yeah, and you develop a kind of intimacy with the materials themselves, often because you're working with them over and over and over again as you're repeating experiments. And intimacy is complicated, right? There's passion there, there's pleasure there, there's also that threat there often. So yeah, going back to the way Sherry Turkle talks about it, it's definitely not a cold intellectual enterprise.
the eros.
Though I think to some, yeah. I mean, I think to a large extent, scientists themselves are to blame for perpetuating the idea that it is this cold, intellectual, entirely rational enterprise. But I think you'll find that, when scientists are talking about the work that they do, especially, with one another, there is a very palpable sense of the eros.
And yeah, and I wonder, in terms of this notion of objectivity, coming back a little bit to your own practice, there is a sort of there's this myth of objectivity where the scientific process is very structured in order to obtain um, reliable or repeatable results, but at the same time, like you're saying, the scientist is a human being. Um, as a poet, when you approach a scientific subject, do you feel like you're also kind of following a sort of methodical um, strategy, but also, to get into this subjectivity of the poetic process, if that makes any sense?
Yeah. I there is method and techniques, but I think both in scientific practice and in artistic or poetic practice, it's much messier than one might think. I think it's, because we use the term the scientific method, right? There can be this kind of sense that, like, oh, right, there's like an overarching method that all scientists follow. And then, of course, they have their particular, field-specific, discipline-specific sub-methods and techniques. But I think the way the work gets done is often much messier than that would suggest. And so with the way I approach the scientific material, I begin with sort of certain approaches that I think I understand, but that quickly becomes a lot of like not understanding exactly what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and sort of allowing that to keep unfolding, and depending on the scientific material itself to guide me in thinking about process and form, and the connections that I'm drawing between the scientific materials and texts and poetic and artistic materials and texts. So allowing there to be a conversation between those. Almost, it's almost so that like I don't have to be original. That material is like offering me everything I need.
But you're both approaching the unknown. I think that's the exciting thing. The scientist wouldn't be doing the experiment if they already knew, whatever scientific principle they're trying to find out, and you wouldn't be doing it if you already knew what the poem was going to be. You wouldn't have to get there. It seems like you're reaching at something.
Yeah. I think maybe, I think there's definitely a sense of the reaching you talk about. Maybe with scientific work, there is at least to begin with perhaps more of a sense of like of what the questions are, that I'm like trying to answer, whereas for me with my poetic practice, I feel like I don't even know when I begin. I don't even know what the questions are, so I'm trying to find the questions as well, and I have no expectation of arriving at any answers. This project, in a sense, started, a very long time ago when I first learned about Okazaki fragments and this process of discontinuous replication, and was just fascinated by it and knew I wanted to do something with it, but didn't know what. And, over the years kind of kept thinking about it and kept thinking about different ways of working with the material. And I think it was when I sort of finally realized that there was a way to work with the text and the concepts that were taking ideas of replication and pairing and continuity and discontinuity, and actually like explore that through poetic form, and use the way, use the process of discontinuous replication to inform the way I structured the manuscript. That's when I was like, oh, okay, now this is something I can do. I've just sort of been bumbling around and like knowing I wanted to do something with this, but not really what or how. And now I understand how to approach it, but there's still a lot of unknowns.
So the blueprint of DNA is the blueprint of your manuscript. It's kind of becomes, your. I'm trying to do with my hands that those strands that you had in that that slide.
The particular process of discontinuous replication becomes a kind of structural foundation for the manuscript.
That's amazing. Okay, so why don't we ask one of Oddity's questions, or why don't I ask one of Oddity's questions?
Okay.
So let's see which one fits into this moment. So in regards to poetic form forms attention, which is honestly is really an amazing line. I think we should name this video "Poetic Form Forms Attention."
But I mean, I can't. That's really just my rephrasing of Lucy Alford. I can't claim credit for that thought.
Okay, well, it's a great thought, and also you have so many quotable quotes throughout your talk. So we're spoiled for choice. In any case, in regard to that quote, poetic form forms attention. I'm wondering how I, as in Aditi Machado, is wondering how you discover the right form for your poems, especially in Okazaki Fragments. Is there something ekphrastic about the forms of the poems? And actually, before you answer that, if I can quickly find this. So this was the issue of Sand that you were in, I believe. Or was it? Or did I get the wrong issue out?
No,
Here
that's
it
the
is.
right issue.
81. Okay, so but maybe you have different forms since then. But just to show, is it visible? No, it's not visible.
Yeah.
So we've got this one fragment here, which actually I don't think this is going to work. But in any case, you have different forms for each fragment, at least in the ones that we published a couple of years ago. So you had couplets, and then you actually had this. I really wish I could show the screen. It looked like a figure from one of their
Yeah, and that's in the talk I gave. I showed that as well.
That figure, yeah, and then you went
yeah.
each line of the figure, and then the third fragment that we published was also in couplets. Anyway, so I don't want to interrupt your answer. Go ahead.
Yeah. So this connects to what we were talking about right before the question, which is that I'm thinking about, okay, what's interesting about this replication process to me, and how do I explore that further in the forms that I'm using, right? So one of the things I'm thinking about is like the nature of pairing and coming together, coming apart, and continuities versus discontinuities, right? Or continuities and discontinuities. So couplets become an obvious way, right, of exploring notions of pairing and using line breaks and stanzas as a way of exploring continuity and discontinuity.
You do have a few strands. I know I said couplets, but there was one loose strand at the bottom of the first fragment, which was interesting.
Yeah, so that particular couplet is also, so part of what I'm also doing is, I mean, related to the idea of pairing, is exploring the relationship between the Okazakis, right? So pairing of DNA strands, pairing of people, and how can I use one to think about the other? Actually, now I'm blanking on whether this is the couplet you published or a different one. Is it the Okazaki died, Okazaki lived?
That's the first fragment. And then the last line you have on the strand that's on its own is Okazaki okay?
Right. Yeah. So that's also about separation and grief.
Yeah.
Right. And in the preceding couplets, you have Okazaki and Okazaki, Okazaki and Okazaki, and then you just have Okazaki in one line alone.
Right.
Right. So yeah.
And the second Okazaki was widowed. Is that right? I mean, I don't.
Yes. Yeah. So they work together, and then one of the Okazakis died at a relatively early age of leukemia. And I think I mentioned in the talk, possibly as a result of exposure to radiation in the Hiroshima bombing. So the narrative of the manuscript, to the extent that there is a narrative, begins with the final paper and Okazaki's death, which happened right before that paper was published, and works backwards to the first paper.
It's so fascinating. So, so when that final paper was published, it was a posthumous, or only one of the Okazakis was alive to see it published.
Yes.
And
went on to have a very distinguished scientific career, which was not possible for her to the same extent, like during the time this research was being done, because of restrictions, and like sort of, I believe, I could be remembering this wrong, but I believe I read in an interview of hers that she wasn't able to have a lab of her own at that time, as a woman.
Yeah.
So if I don't use she, he, him, her pronouns in the manuscript at all, because part of what I'm interested in is exploring this pairing without introducing those like gendered notions of what pairing is, or conventional notions about what gender pairs are. And I want there to be this kind of slippage between sort of thinking about Okazaki and Okazaki as people and as like molecules or like strands of DNA.
So they kind of, there's this, the DNA strand is going through, and they match along their way on the path of the replication, or however we think of human beings. That's so interesting. So yeah, I would say, when we were editing it, we didn't realize it was two Okazakis when we first selected your poem, and I remember sometime in that process, whether it was during making that, putting together that issue, or maybe even after it was published, I did a little Googling and found out all this cool stuff about them. But it's really interesting, I think, to see a series of poems that is constructed around a very concrete scientific, what's the word, process of this replication, and also these two people's specific lives, but your form is so independent of that, in a way that, like, if you read the poems without knowing this background, there's this playfulness, and there's this wonder that it gives you. The kind of it reminded me a little bit. I'm blanking on the name. There was this 18th century British poet who was confined to an institution and wrote this 300-page poem about a cat, and it had like all these amazing lines in it.
Oh, yeah. It'll come to me.
Anyway, we both know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But there were a few lines in that second fragment that sort of reminded me of this kind of, this sense of delight and kind of without the context, not knowing where things were coming from, because there are things that you give us as a reader, and then there are things that you withhold, and that's also really interesting. And I think that the things that you withhold help us enjoy the poem on its own. It doesn't need to have all of this kind of background, forward introduction kind of thing. The poem is the poem.
Christopher Smart.
Christopher Smart.
Yeah. Some of that, withholding is also just a result of not having a lot of biographical information about the Okazakis, and using that sort of to my advantage, and allowing what I do know of their lives to become intertwined with what I know of the process of discontinuous DNA replication, so that it's what I'm also pairing are the process and their lives, right, and letting them be in conversation instead of simply sort of using the process as a way to tell a kind of to create a biographical work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in elements of their biography and how they inform their research and vice versa, rather than just creating a narrative about their lives.
I wanted to get to another question from Aditi Machado. Sorry, I think you said it's pronounced Aditi. So what would you say to a young poet who wants to explore poetry and science simultaneously but is told not to?
Yeah, I don't really know. I think I would it would depend on why they are being told not to, in the sense that, like, there are a lot of practical challenges to doing multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary work, especially when we're talking about, we're not talking like biochemistry, right? We're talking like poetry and whatever field of science. And I think there's likely to be this attitude of, well, are you really serious about either one if you're trying to do both? Mm-hmm. Right? And I mean, I absolutely disagree with the idea that you cannot seriously pursue both. And there are some examples of people who have done have had sort of what would be considered like a legitimate scientific career by any standards, and also legitimate poetry. But I think it would require somebody who's extremely self-motivated and extremely impervious to those kinds of criticisms of, well, you're not really serious, or like, we're not really going to invest in you if you're also going to be doing this other thing. I think the student would have to be somebody who is willing and able to do a lot of the work of like finding and creating opportunities for themselves, because people are going to be resistant to offering them to you.
Yeah. Interesting.
So, I mean, I would love to see, I would love to have more students who would come to me with like, hey, I want to do both of these things, right? And like try to figure out together like how we can make that happen. But I don't think there's inherently a lot of institutional support for that.
Well, I think it does seem to some extent, like you said, to be an institutional problem, in the sense that I think the hard sciences are almost by definition an academic pursuit, and especially in the US. Being a poet has become an academic pursuit because it doesn't pay for itself. So so a writer like yourself ends up being attached to an institution in that sense, and you can't be in both the biology and MFA sort of departments, poetry departments. Not actually, I guess it would be just be creative writing. But I could imagine it would be possible to be a biologist and write poetry on the side. Maybe a little bit more difficult to do the other way around.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking of like Miroslav Holub, for example, who, you know, was a scientist and wrote poetry. You know, we'll say on the side, but not. I don't mean that as like a way to diminish the work, right? But
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying, that it is possible to do the poetry without institutional support, right? If you have like a job, but it's not possible really to do the science without institutional support. So I did just want to quickly go back to the question about form you had asked earlier when we were talking about couplets, and just also mention that I think one of the pieces you published in Sand, which is the second couplet piece, is playing on the ghazal form.
Oh yeah.
Which also, you know, was a result of thinking about the way ghazals work with couplets that are, in a sense, discontinuous, right? Thinking about what like Aga Shahid Ali called the ravishing disunities of ghazals. So that's another way in which, like, I'm thinking about, okay, how do I take these ideas of pairing and discontinuity and find form for them in a poem?
Yeah, that completely lit a light bulb, because I hadn't realized that that's what you were doing, but it seems like the perfect form for that, you know, because it is couplets, but then each one's changing a little bit, and then they're all kind of return. That's great.
And there are the repetitions at the ends of the lines.
I'll have to look at it again after this. Actually, I just have one more question myself, which is where can we find more of these fragments? So I showed everyone Sand issue 19, but that's just 3 of them. So I know you've been publishing them in different places.
Yeah, there is a list of publications on my website. So that should list all the Okazaki fragments that have currently been published, where you can find them. At least there's a set of fragments. There's another set of fragments available online through Foglifter. The rest, I think, are not available online, but you can see where they're published on my website. And, you know, if you don't have access to those journals but want to read the fragments, just like send me a message and I will find a way to get them to you. There is supposed to be a chapbook of fragments coming out at some point too, and it's really just been held up by my wanting to make changes to the manuscript and not making them quickly enough. But that will hopefully also be available sometime later this year.
Looking forward to that. Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And everyone watching at home, you can find Kanika's website. We'll put it in the description below. And you can find the other Okazaki fragments in the different places. And yeah, also, if you are interested in seeing the entire Poetic Visions webinar, of which Kanika's presentation was the final part, you can also find that on Crowdcast through Sand, and if you sign up, you can still you can still watch the replay. Thank you so much.